West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
Chief R. Stacey Laforme is the chief of the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nation, which is the closest nation to West Hill United on 62 Orchard Park Drive. This poem is written in the voice of an Indigenous soldier returning from the First World War. It's addressed to his white brother, with whom he fought side by side. He bears no ill will to his brother, but he can't help but be hurt by the fact that he returns to Canada as a second-class citizen. I Love This Land by Chief R. Stacey Laforme. You were and always shall be my brother. We were all the same colour, wrapped in the flag of this nation. My blood flowed as freely as yours. Mixed in the fields, one could not be distinguished from the other. Yet, when we came home, when the nation's colours were removed, difference became apparent, not between you and me, God willing, never, but in the eyes of those for whom we laid down our lives. Oh, we still stood shoulder to shoulder in the parades, but the government thought that your life was more valuable than mine. So you were given land, property, while I waited. And I waited. I know what you were given was not enough for what we endured. Still, it was much more than I. I am not envious of you, brother. I believe you deserve even more than you received, but it hurt me very badly. I am not ashamed to say I cried. And why not? I bled, I died, I killed. Why does my country think I am unworthy? The enemy I fought could never be as cruel as the people I came back to embrace. I gave so much, lived through so much, and then you who I would give all for, you pushed me aside as if I was inconsequential. I feel as if I have been spat upon by one I honoured. Do I feel good, having to ask you for what should have been given long ago? No. In fact, I am a little ashamed to ask for justice in this, for I never went to war for money, for glory, for reward. I went because it was the right thing to do. And, God forgive me, I would go again. This may seem an old wound to you, but it is a wound that never heals. For it is a wound to my people's heart and soul, and insult to our pride. And we deserve so much better, especially from you. Offered as wisdom for the journey. May we walk
in its light.
Judy Brannan Armbruster is a direct descendant of the Karuk tribe of Northern California. She is a poet and a photographer. She writes of the World Renewal Ceremony, where each year the Karakakara gather to smoke and fast and chant and dance to restore the balance of the earth. They are seeking renewal, a new world, a fresh start. She dedicates this poem to Brian Tripp, a ceremonial dancer of her people. World Renewal Ceremony for Brian Tripp by Judy Brannan Armbruster. It is made this way. Each year it is done for the people. This is the way of renewal, the circle of life brought into balance. Smoke, prayers, fasting, sweating, chanting, dancing. Once a year, Karakakara gather to make the world new again. Come with good heart. Come with friends and enemies. Come with love. In the chant, in the song, in the stamping feet, all is set right. Shake the earth, shake off evil, realign energy. This is how it's done when the world is made new for World Renewal Ceremony. Offered as wisdom for the journey. May we walk in its light.
We are all treaty people. Sometimes we say that when we do our land acknowledgement at the beginning of our gatherings. And it's a statement that has become more and more prevalent in recent years. Indigenous people have been reminding settlers of the fact that in a very real sense, we are all treaty people. For many years, I believed that the treaties were for Indigenous people, but not me. I thought the treaties were part of history and irrelevant today. And I thought that even though many of the treaties proclaim they are valid as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the wind blows. And I thought that treaties meant that Indigenous people gave up title to the land and gave up their sovereignty, but that's not true either. Treaties were intended to set parameters so that two nations could live together. And whatever the cause, we can see that one group of people is not thriving as they should, as we try to live together in a good way. We heard of the complaints of Chief Stacey Laforme. We know of the crushing poverty of Indigenous people. And there's many First Nations communities without drinkable water. And there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons. And every Sunday we remember the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit women who face such continued violence. And we can just not say that we are living together in a good way. We just can't say that. But we know we're called to live together in a good way. And our Indigenous neighbors have told us that living up to the treaties can help us along that path to right relationship. And so it behooves us to really understand what we mean by treaty before we can say that we're all treaty people. What does that actually mean? And as I've just showed you, for much of my life, I didn't really know what a treaty meant, what the treaties that formed my country meant. And so, what is a treaty? A treaty is an agreement. A treaty is a commitment. It's a promise. It's two parties entering into a relationship that will set the parameters of how they will treat one another, of how they will live together side by side. Treaties are agreements, commitments, promises that each side must live up to. And when two parties enter into treaty, they're committing to how they will live together in relationship. And we know that relationship is so important in our reality of the web of life. And you can see how the importance of relationship sheds light on some of the misconceptions I highlighted just a few minutes ago. Remember, I thought the treaties meant that indigenous people gave up title to the land and gave up their sovereignty. But when we look closer, we can see that almost every treaty, in fact, every treaty should, include the right for indigenous people to hunt and fish on their land. Indigenous people remain themselves on their historic lands. And what the treaties do is they establish how settlers are able to move and build houses and businesses on that land while living together with indigenous people there and to share the land. The treaties tell us how indigenous people and settlers have agreed to live on the land at the same time. And if commitments are made in the treaties, it's important that they are good faith commitments. If we are to be grounded in life, as we say we are here at West Hill United, then we should be entering into any commitment, any agreement in good faith. And that means when we make a commitment, it must be beneficial to both sides. We should not be looking to win the treaty. We should not be looking to get everything we can. We must center the well-being of both parties in the treaty. And it's to our great shame as Canadians that we have not always lived up to this standard. Often we looked at treaties as a way to get what we wanted, what we needed, without concern for our neighbor. And one of the examples is the Williams Treaties, which are one of the treaties that are set closest to where I am standing right now, along with Treaty 20. And the Williams Treaties were signed by 3 Chippewa and 4 Mississauga Anishinaabe First Nations, and the Crown in 1923, after the government appointed the Williams Commission to settle outstanding land claims in southern Ontario. The commission found that not all of the land had been fully ceded, and 2 new treaties were developed. And now, unlike previous treaties, every other treaty included hunting and fishing rights, but the Williams Treaties did not. It did not, even though the Royal Proclamation of 1763 said that the land belongs to Indigenous people. Now, King George III reserved the right to take some of the land himself, but Indigenous people had the right to live on the land according to that proclamation. And so in order to live their lives, they hunted and fished. And for Indigenous people, that's a spiritual activity, something they must do. And in 1985, George Howard, who was of Hiawatha First Nation, was charged with fishing out of season. And in the court, he argued that his rights were protected by the Williams Treaty. But the Ontario Court of Appeals found that federal fishing rights did not exist in that treaty. So then the signees, the Indigenous nations who signed the Williams Treaty, they took the government to court for financial compensation for the surrendered land and harvesting rights. And the Canadian courts found that the treaties were not negotiated in good faith. The Williams Treaties tried to deny hunting and fishing rights, but the precedents in previous treaties and the Royal Proclamation of 1763 found in favor of the First Nations. And in 2018, the 7 First Nations who signed the Williams Treaty and the federal government and the provincial governments came to a settlement, and they signed a $1.1 billion settlement. The Williams Treaties were not negotiated in good faith. The government of Canada tried to pull a fast one, and the courts overturned it almost 100 years later. And this highlights another important truth. When our Indigenous neighbors, when their nations take the Canadian government to court, they almost always win. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out of court action. And our courts decided that there should be some kind of reconciliation. And I think there's something wrong in the way we, in the West, with our Western nation building, it's so confrontational, it's even selfish. We look at treaties as a way to get what we want, not a way to live with one another in right relationship. And we haven't entered in to relationship with our Indigenous neighbors in good faith. And this also lifts up the fact that the treaties are an agreement between 2 nations. Now, for the Williams Treaties, we could say there was 8 nations, but the Canadian government had a treaty with each of those nations. And this nation-to-nation fact is extremely important. Indigenous people for a long time have been asking Canada to engage with them on a nation-to-nation basis. And the history of our treaties enforces that practice. The Williams Treaties were signed between the Crown, which in Canada means the Canadian government, and each of the 7 local nations. And the nation is so important. That word nation is so important. This is why Indigenous communities refer to themselves as First Nations, because they're nations. They're distinct nations. They're not a club. They're not an organization. They're a nation. And so therefore, when a treaty is signed, it is signed between 2 nations. Or in the case of the Williams Treaties, between the Crown and each of those distinct 7 nations. Or in the case of the number of treaties out west, between each First Nation and Her Majesty the Queen, which would have been Queen Victoria. And so understanding treaties as an agreement between 2 parties or 2 nations is an important part of our understanding of ourselves as a treaty people. When a treaty is understood between 2 nations, that means that each nation is a part of that treaty. Canada would never become a nation without these treaties. The only reason there is a Canada is because of treaties. So if you believe in democracy, then you must account for the treaties, and therefore we are all treaty people. And this doesn't apply to just Canadians. Our American siblings have their own treaties and their own relationships. And for our UK members of the treaties, many of them were signed between Indigenous nations and the King or Queen of England. And so you're a treaty people as well. And the United Nations has passed the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is also known as UNDRIP. And that declares, among other things, that Indigenous people must be consulted when resource extraction affects their land. If you support our government, if you support the UN, if you support our basic liberal institutions, then we are all treaty people. We are all treaty people, and that means something. It must mean something. If we are to be grounded in life and guided by love and growing in wisdom, it must mean that the well-being of our Indigenous people, not only in our neighborhood, not only in our country, but around the world, it means honoring the nation status of Indigenous people. It means being in relationship, in right relationship, committed to good relationship. Relationship where everyone has a chance to flourish. We often talk about the web of life and the interconnectedness of all beings and all becomings in the web of life. And we see this manifested through relationship. That the well-being of everyone and everything is the path to the well-being for each of us individually. And this interconnectedness, this connectedness in the web of life cannot be overstated. In fact, quantum physics tells us that the vibrations from my voice as I speak right now can affect a molecule in a star at the edge of the universe instantly. The greatest illusion in our universe is the illusion of separation, because we are all connected. We depend on one another. And we are all connected. And we can live together in harmony. Yes, we can look back and say that we have committed wrongs, but that doesn't mean we have to continue to commit wrongs. The as is not the same as the will be. We can have new relationships. We can have a new world. As the Karuka people were telling, they gather every year to renew the world. Well, we can renew the world as well, in our way, through our relationships with our Indigenous neighbors, through our relationship in the web of life. We can renew the world through our engagement in the treaties, through life-giving treaties. We can renew the world by declaring and living that we are all treaty people. Miigwech.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.